The Arab Spring has been less successful in Egypt despite ousting two presidents since the start of the revolution. The first to go was Hosni Mubarak in early 2011 after nearly 3 decades in power. Then it was the first democratically elected Egyptian President Mohammed Morsi. To discuss the revolution in Egypt, I'm joined now by Hassan Mneimneh, a senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks for joining us. Egypt, long regarded as the most influential of all the Arab countries. We had President Hosni Mubarak, as I've just mentioned, he was overthrown. Mohammed Morsi overthrown. Now the military has taken over. Has Egypt gone full circle?
Yeah, in more ways than one, it has. The revolution in Egypt was about getting rid of an authoritarian regime that was paternalistic in its treatment of the population, while at the same time very harsh in the repressive measures that it had applied. And what we see now is the reemergence of what amounts to the anointment of a military leader to the office of presidency and repressive measures as harsh as ever. So
I'm just wondering, is this going to be ultimately acceptable to the Egyptian people, or are we going to see more unrest in the years ahead?
There is currently quite a bit of revolution fatigue, and that's an opportunity for the new government to settle itself in and to try to restore order the way it sees fit. But ultimately, the wall of fear that had blocked the Egyptian public from demanding representative government has crumbled. And therefore, it is a matter of time before effectively we have a rebuild up of revolutionary forces and we have a repeat of the cycle. But the most important issue here is that the new government, whether it is Sisi, which is the very likely possibility, or whatever incarnation, will be unable to deliver on the promises that it's currently making, of restoring the old formula of service provision to the public in exchange for political acquiescence. And therefore, we're likely to see quite a bit in the following years. Egypt is a very hard case in the context of the Arab Spring.
Indeed, very complex, because when we look at the Morsi government, which was democratically elected, was it a case on the part of that government of implementing too much change too soon?
Unfortunately not. It was not being true to the spirit of the revolution. Let's keep in mind, we keep on insisting it was democratically elected, but the legitimacy in the context of a transitional period is not in the procedural democratic process. It is really in carrying through what the promises were. The promise was one of inclusion of the various forces that led to the revolution. The promise was one of reform to which a national consensus would emerge. Unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood, ultimately Morsi being the figurehead here, what the Muslim Brotherhood did is assume that being democratically elected is like a blank check to do whatever they please. And they proceeded in a very clumsy way in an attempt to take over the state. But that state had enough structures to resist, and ultimately that state staged what amounts to a counter-revolution. And we have them out of power, and we have the revolution, at least in its original incarnation, completely diffused.
But shouldn't that change have come through the ballot box rather than a mass uprising again, which brought the military to power?
Well, let's keep in mind that there were no structures for the procedural democracy that we would have expected to indeed carry through the changes as they happen. By that I mean, let's not forget how Morsi, for example, attributed to himself powers, extra constitutional powers unprecedented in the history of Egypt. Not that he could implement them, not that he could carry them through. He did that out of fear of the military. But effectively, what we had was a transitional period during which what would have been important was some level of national consensus, some level of national dialogue that effectively brings everyone in, instead of one party assuming that because I won, despite the fact that I'm breaking my promise of inclusion, I can claim that I'm democratically elected, and that's that. And this is currently really the tragedy of Egypt, that the Muslim Brotherhood, who are still really a peaceful organization to a large extent, are unable to recognize the fact that they made terrible mistakes, and therefore the coup, as much as it can be blamed on the military, is also their responsibility, and therefore a new dialogue has to be set in place.
But was it perhaps a mistake on the part of the military to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood, to say that this is now a terrorist organization, it has no place in Egypt?
By all means, this is an excess that unfortunately Egypt will pay the price of this excess for years to come. First of all, the military tried, through actually beyond the military, the state tried to conflate all Islamisms in the plural. We have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an accommodationist Islamist that recognizes a compatibility between its ideology and democracy. In fact, it presents itself and it does its best to be true to it as a democratic entity. Now, as I mentioned, their understanding of democracy might be a little bit in need of fine-tuning because they favored, if you'd like, the literal and the procedural over the substantive. But nonetheless, the military has tried to conflate them with Al-Qaeda, and the radical Islamists who completely reject any type of legitimacy for the system and blame them, meaning blame the Muslim Brotherhood, for the excesses of the radicals, which is not only unfair, really, it's very cynical. Along the lines, you want to get rid of an opponent, you pretend that that opponent is the real enemy of the nation. They are a considerable part of Egyptian society, and therefore this banning of the Muslim Brotherhood and the attempt at eradicating it from Egyptian life will ultimately fail and will cause trouble down the line.
And I guess it is also causing massive polarization in Egypt between those who support the Muslim Brotherhood and those who think that there should be more democratic reforms, those who perhaps support the military as well.
Yeah, Egypt today is completely split between competing narratives. But let's actually just commenting on what you said. Yeah, at one point, Egypt was a battle between democrats and autocrats, and the theocrats seem to have stepped in and benefited from it. But really, the democrats did not live up to their claim of being Democrats. Liberals in Egypt today support the eradication of the Muslim Brotherhood. How liberal is that? Liberals today in Egypt support military dictatorship. We have to reconsider categories in the case of Egypt.
Well, you've got some very strange bedfellows there, as you say, you know, the military hardliners on one side and the liberals on the other. And, you know, indications, well, from what we're hearing of what the military is doing, they don't look very good. I mean, the leader says he wants some kind of immunity for the military from any actions that they take. He wants the primacy of the military in economic activity in the country. In other words, they want to take over more and more of the economic institutions. Mm-hmm. There is also, well, there was a suggestion at one point that girls who are in the demonstrations be tested for their virginity.
Well, they have done that early on in the course of the revolution. If you remember, in Tahrir Square, they rounded up girls and tested them for their virginity, never apologized for it, considering it to be a legitimate measure. We're talking here really excesses of power that lead not only to steps and actions that are outrageous. I mean, there was even a claim that the military discovered a cure for AIDS. And when legitimate doctors medical doctors went on TV saying, let us be careful here, let us not make excessive claims, they were accused of treason. Because how can you doubt that our almighty military is capable of doing X? We're talking about a situation in which really the military is going into severe excesses and with no internal checks and balances. And this is the danger that Egypt is facing.
Now, of course, elections have been announced. The military leader, al-Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, will be standing for president. But the biggest, and as we've been talking about, the most popular party in the country, the Muslim Brotherhood, will not be on the ballot.
Well, because it is not a political party anymore. It's a banned terrorist organization, according to the Egyptian state institution,
right.
which is absurd.
I'm wondering, to what extent will these elections be legitimate then?
Again, I mean, legitimacy is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, at the end, what you will have is you'll have enough of a turnout to be able to claim that here we have an elected president, and this elected president is now the leader, and you have to accept it. The problem with all of this is, once again, that in periods of transition, the majority-minority does not operate the same way as in an established, stable democracy. In an established, stable democracy, we have measures to ensure that there's no tyranny of the majority and the rights and responsibilities of the minorities are guaranteed. We have nothing of the sort in the case of Egypt. We have might is right, and might is going to claim that it has also a democratic right here.
Let's look at one other issue, and that is the United States' relationship with Egypt. Where does that leave the United States? The administration here has been very reluctant to call this a coup. And we know the reason for that is as soon as you call it a coup, it automatically cuts off aid, massive aid that the United States supplies to Egypt.
Well, the United States deals with Egypt and with much of the Middle East, actually with all the Middle East, in layers of priorities. Layer number one is security. Anything that has to do with terrorism, anything that has to do with a collapse, meaning a military conflict of any sort. This is layer number one. Layer number two is stability. You need not just the economy to be reasonably stable, but not to have unrest to the point where you have a threat to the global order. Layer number three is democracy. Unfortunately, these are the layers. So given that in the case of Egypt, we really are talking about issues of security, even beyond stability, clearly the United States has to step back and try to find a formula in which it can appear as if it's true to its values. It's doing its best, but it's not easy, while at the same time really get focused on the issues of security and stability long before, well before, it really stresses on issues of democracy. The United States has been guilty in this whole process of giving the Morsi government if you like, too fast of recognition of legitimacy that encouraged it actually to act autocratic the way it did. And then it's also guilty of not being vocal enough once that government was toppled by the military to recognize the fact that it was a coup. But these two excesses on the part of the United States stem from the fact that we live in the real world and there are legitimate, actually solid interests of security, of stability that are in need, and Egypt is indispensable. Egypt is not a country with which the United States can part ways. It has to have some connection with Egypt.
But the United States, as you've been pointing out, will always act in its own interests first.
Like every other country on earth.
Okay, Hassan Mneimneh, thanks for joining us.